would like to present now Stephen Hodas, who is going to talk to us from a totally different perspective. David talked to us about information, about this revolution, evolution, disruption, whatever we have to deal with information. And Stephen is going to talk to us about his perspective from the entrepreneurial point of view. He was one of the initiators of the iZone in New York, where they built an educational system based with the entrepreneurial culture. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. And perfect so far. So, David was just talking about what do we need to do to prepare our kids for this new world, this new knowledge heuristic. And I'm going to talk actually about what do we need to prepare our schools and our school systems in order to prepare our kids. It's a very different set of problems. So we know that people of any age will persist and will strive under even the most oppressive conditions, that human beings are infinitely inventive, imaginative, and adaptable. But bureaucratic institutions, which is what schools are very nearly the opposite of that. Their survival depends on repressing the imaginative energies of those who work there, as well as those that they work on. And that's exactly what schools do to many students. There is a pretty large body of research at this point that shows that student interest in math, in literacy, in science, in art, as well as student self-assessment of whether they're good at those subjects is highest in kindergarten and in first grade. And that the longer that students are in school, the more those two factors, their interest and their sense of ability, decline. This is true across all populations of kids, regardless of their income, their race, or their sex. At the same time, evidence also shows that over that same period, students have more and more engagement and satisfaction, whereas in extracurricular activities, they report high motivation and high concentration. And sadly, this is what schools, as we know them, do to kids. Predictably and reliably, they subtract value, they diminish kids' capacity. And to a large extent, this is the same for the people who work in schools. We like to flatter educators that they're professionals, but very little about their working condition or their practice culture resembles what professionals actually do. So I don't think that we intentionally did this. I don't think we designed schools to degrade human intellect or crush human spirit, but we did intentionally build a school machine around regulations that are designed only to make it easy to run that machine. Regulations like scheduling and fixed buildings and predefined subject areas and predefined age groupings and seat time. So we put the rules at the center, and we expect that educators and students will conform themselves to those rules and kind of warp themselves around them. And for a long time, apparently, we were fine with that. But now society has decided that this bureaucracy, which we've organized for uniformity and for compliance, needs to create in students exactly the opposite set of attitudes: flexibility, resourcefulness, and problem solving. But unfortunately, we have this huge installed base of schools, of educators and administrators and vendors who supply the schools, who've all been trained up to just do what they're told, not to ask too many questions, not to make too many suggestions, to follow the letter of the regulation, even if it violates the spirit, even if it literally makes no sense at all. And once people accept this framework, the educators, the administrators, it doesn't matter what they're doing, they will do a bad job of it, because the actual purpose of the work has been replaced by this regime of compliance. And that's why most education reform fails. And we've seen a lot of it, especially in the US over the last 20 years. Lots of attempts to do different things with really very little reward. And it's because we tend to think that schools are doing the wrong things, whereas the problem is that schools do things wrongly, whatever it is that they do. So if you want to change that, if you want to change the way that educators and school systems act, what do you do? So at the New York City Department of Ed, about 5 years ago, they created the Office of Innovation, which is called the iZone, to sort of be the research and development lab for the district. And the iZone said, okay, what if we started by reversing the baseline assumption that the rules should be at the center, and instead we put the kids and the teachers at the center and made those other things revolve around them. And that's essentially the definition of personalized learning, which was the goal of the iZone. So the question was then, well, what do you need to create that kind of system? What kind of people do you want to work in those schools? What kinds of tools would they need? What would the central office need to do to support those people? And at the iZone, to answer those questions, we believed that you had to work in 3 areas simultaneously. You had to actually be working in classrooms, because that's where the real work takes place. You had to work in the central office, because that creates the rules that make it hard for educators to do the real work. And you have to work in the marketplace, because everything that schools do, ultimately they buy in one form or another. And if you reward the market for giving you mediocrity, then that's what you'll get. Historically, that's what you have gotten. And so to each of those areas of work, we brought 2 principles that came from outside of education, user-centered design and lean startup methodology. And if you're not familiar with those, I would definitely encourage you to look them up. They share a lot in common. In a nutshell, they believe that respect and empathy for your user, humility in the designer, small, cheap experiments, and being eager to fail in a smart way is the best path to building something that people will love and therefore that people will use. And they believe that the best way to make a big change is through a thoughtful series of small steps. So obviously, humility, empathy, respect are not core values of bureaucracies. The entire point of a bureaucracy is not to care, is not to think, is not to acknowledge the differences between things. That's the core theory of action. The only thing a bureaucracy can value or evaluate, essentially, is compliance. And almost by definition, a bureaucratic system cannot discover or learn, since it excludes from its view everything that's unexpected and everything that's unknown, which for it represent problems or failures rather than opportunities for learning or for delight. And for schools, this squeezing out of usefulness, of meaning and pleasure is a particular problem, because unless educators feel and transmit usefulness, meaning, and pleasure, kids simply won't learn. And that they mostly don't transmit them is the reason I believe that I said before, that the more time kids spend in school, the less motivated and capable many of them become. So educators are caught in the middle. On the one hand, they've been trained and rewarded to be the enforcers of these rules and values that process students as identical lumps of raw material. But on the other hand, they see and feel every day the way that their own creative energies and their expertise are stifled and ignored and squandered by the system in which they work. And most of them have very clear ideas about what they would change if they were able to change it. So in the iZone, we gave them that chance. The way to change organizations is to shift the expectations of the people who do the work in them every day. And you start that process by creating examples for them of how it could be different. But you have to be careful of how you go about it. The reason that schools and similar organizations are so stable is because they're so good at detecting and neutralizing threats and critiques. So if you want to bypass that immune system, you need a sort of a Trojan horse. And in the iZone, we had permission to try new things, and we used that permission to put a Trojan horse inside of a Trojan horse inside of a Trojan horse, bury it really deep, bringing in user-centered design and lean startup as a way to inject into the system empathy and respect, which are in turn connected to usefulness, meaning, and pleasure. And one of the first things we did was to run an open software challenge for middle school math. Now, software challenges are not rocket science. We had a fabulous one this weekend. Lots of people do them, but no one had ever done one at that point for schools before. And we liked it as a Trojan horse because it replaced the typical way that bureaucracies define and solve problems. This is a diagram of the New York City procurement process. To replace this with something more unspecified and uncontrolled, and those things are very like kryptonite to bureaucracies. So the other agenda that we had hidden inside the software challenge was giving teachers the authority to define their own problems and pick their own solutions, which is extremely rare for teachers to get either of those opportunities, and also to create relationships between teachers as professionals and software developers so that they could work together to design software that would genuinely meet the needs that teachers had in their classrooms. So from the outside, this process looked like it was about the technology, like it was about the software. And a lot of the work that we did in the iZone looked like it was about technology. But actually what we cared about was creating these collaborative relationships, which in turn would generate this usefulness, meaning, and pleasure.
Today, we're going to start to learn about algebraic expressions. Who remembers what a variable is?
iZone definitely has a different way of approaching things, so I really did not know what to expect.
The goal of the Gap App Challenge was to put a call out to innovative software developers everywhere to help close the gap in performance in middle school math. One of the incentives for people to participate in the Gap App Challenge was that everybody who entered had the opportunity then to partner with one of our schools to further refine and develop their product in the context of a real urban classroom. Getting that authentic stakeholder voice, that user-centered design, is really at the heart of everything that we do.
We had dual goals. I had goals as an educator to help develop my students to become better learners, and his goals were to better adjust his product to meet the needs from like real life experiences.
School environments are really different from the startup world. So startups have their hoodies and their ping pong tables, and teachers work in classrooms with kids every day. And so to get them to work together, we had to do some empathy building and some relationship building to make sure that they were talking the same language and understanding each other and the different environments that they worked in.
One of the key supports that the iZone provided was a safe learning space for either side of the team to build that common vocabulary and that communal understanding of what user-centered design and this whole process of iteration was.
The Gap app gave us a facilitated relationship that committed us to communicating with the end users in a way that we would not have otherwise.
We work with the developer every week, every Thursday morning. We talk about things that we can improve, things that are going wonderful, and if there are things that need to be improved, he's on it right away.
We got along. They started using our product right away. They started asking questions right away. We started basically going back and forth.
They essentially asked us, hey, what do you need? What is your dream classroom? What does it look like? And they were able to build around our basic needs. So it's been so smooth.
It was a constant process of growing and changing and talking and coming into the classroom, adjusting.
When we develop, we don't have that feedback, that instant feedback from students, from teachers. And this is what Lauren can bring us. They help us fine-tweak the software. They change our assumptions about how a classroom is run. That exchange is really, really helpful for developers.
And it's very nice for teachers when we find certain frustrations or what we would change to be able to talk to the developers and have that change very quickly. And then our kids to say, oh, look, this has already happened. They really feel like they have a stake in what's going on and that their input matters. And it does. It definitely does. I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
I'm happy to hear that.
Oh, good, Carl.
For this assignment, you're going to take two songs, okay? They have to have what?
A similar beats per minute.
Beats per minute. And you're going to match them up, okay? So they have the same tempo, okay? So the first thing you got to do...
We initially thought that the apps would really focus on specific content and math, but there were also needs from educators that arose when we did user research that said they needed support for other things in the classroom, like behavior management, screencasting, and other technology support that wasn't just curricular.
My collaboration with the developers has been really, really easy. They came into the classroom and helped set up equipment, walked us through things. It's a much more intimate experience with the developer, and that has opened my eyes to seeing that some people do really care about what goes on in the classroom.
Often in ed tech, it's really easy to get bogged down in the backside of the product, and we forget to go to schools and actually ask teachers what they want and what would be helpful. And this Gap App Challenge has really made it very clear that getting into the school is half the challenge, but also like the most important thing you could do as a developer.
these teachers, these students, they are our clients, and we want to transform and make sure that the software works really well for them. And that process means having a back and forth, and it shouldn't be just one annual thing or something like that. It should be a continuous process. And I think the Gap App project basically started that loop.
The best part about this whole program has been the autonomy has returned back to the classroom, back to the teacher. Every day that I use the app, it's based on the lessons that I created. It's stuff that I've already done, and it's enhancing. While teachers say, hey, I don't want another plate on the table, this has become the plate. This has become the table. It's become the basics. It's not something extra. It's basically what I'm using every day.
This is the most I've ever used technology. But now that I realize incorporating this program and incorporating technology into the classroom, it opened up a whole new world for me and for the children, because I'm learning too.
One of the pieces of advice that I'd give to other districts trying to do the same thing is just to be patient. So much can come out of this if you just give folks the time and the space to work it out together.
All over the country, districts are starting to go down this path. Foundations are funding this because the very, very clear value that's generated for everybody involved.
New York is doing something that's completely innovative, and this is definitely something that EdTech needs to be watching because it's really important to our schools and also just like to our kids.
So, a timeout, wow. Okay, very, very quickly, we basically used the success of this. It was very public, and it gave us a lot of credibility inside the organization to move on and do a bunch of different things to create more of this empathy building. We did Shark Tanks with educators and parents and students, but most importantly, we started to work with the bureaucrats themselves, with the central office staff, to get them to approach their work like anthropologists, studying their own culture and practice, so that we could create examples for them of how they could go about doing their jobs differently. And since everything in bureaucracies runs on precedent, the first time is really hard, the second time is exponentially easier, the third time is easier than that, and by the fourth time you're doing it, it is just sort of the way that we do things here. Basically, these three legs, the classroom, the marketplace, and the policy level, each of those moves along unevenly. In New York, we had tremendous success in the classroom and in the marketplace. Policy, we had a change in administrations. New administration comes in. They keep some of those values. Some of them they discard. But as the three legs of the stool, when those two legs move, the third leg has to follow, and it does follow. And it may follow unevenly, it may be slowly and awkwardly, but ultimately it does follow along, and that's how you make big change in little steps.